Representative Steve King from Iowa has a long history of saying things that most people who can think for themselves would deem racist. And we're gonna show you examples of that in just a minute. But during a recent interview with the New York Times, King couldn't understand why white nationalist was something offensive. In fact, he was quoted as saying in this Times piece, white nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization, how did that language become offensive? And then he said, why did I sit in classes teaching me about the merits of our history and our civilization? Now, following that statement, a number of Republican lawmakers have been calling on Representative King to resign. And it appears that they have now decided to strip him of any committee power within the House of Representatives. So all the committees that he was on, he will no longer serve on. King had been a member of the House Judiciary, Agriculture, and Small Business Committees. He had also served as chairman of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution and Civil Justice in the last Congress.
Now, the Republicans had seen all of the other racist things that Steve King had said in the past. And they still had him, not just on the Judiciary Committee, but as the chairman of the subcommittee on the Constitution and Civil Justice. They put this guy as the chairman of the subcommittee on Civil Justice. I mean, that is basically spitting in minorities' faces. They already know all the other things that he said. Look, Steve King actually made an interesting defense of this last outrageous comment by saying, hey, look, the New York Times got me out of context in that I was saying, hey, white nationalism, white supremacy is one thing. Well, that's not what he said, but I was referring to Western civilization, and how did that become a bad word? Because we're taught in classes about how great our civilization is. And that's an interesting point, and that's why sometimes progressives say, no, we should teach more accurate history. It doesn't mean that America is bad and the West is bad. It means sometimes we've done great things, sometimes we've done terrible things. And so, but Steve King doesn't want you to know that. So he's saying, look, I was just referring to Western civilization because we don't teach that white nationalism and white supremacy is good in classes. Okay, that'd be an interesting offense if it was not for the rest of the context that we're about to show you. Steve King has made one racist comment after another, and this time he got his hand caught in the cookie jar. So I think what the Republicans get upset at people like Steve King for is not for being racist, but for exposing the rest of them for agreeing to all those policies anyway, but just not saying the racist words. That's why they're so annoyed with Steve King.
Yes.
We were doing all these wonderfully discriminatory policies in the first place, and now Steve, you're gonna go expose it by actually naming it.
And he can't help himself. I think that following Trump's election, he has felt emboldened to be a lot more open about his white supremacy. And so we're gonna give you all the examples that we've seen throughout the years that prove who Representative King really is. And let's start off with this infamous video of King talking about the Dreamers and what their calves are like. Take a look.
Parents brought them in, it wasn't their fault. It's true in some cases, but they aren't all valedictorians. They weren't all brought in by their parents. For everyone who's a valedictorian, there's another 100 out there that they weigh 130 pounds and they've got calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert.
So he characterizes most of the Dreamers as individuals who are trying to smuggle drugs across the border in their calves because they have calves the size of cantaloupes.
I mean, look, do I have to bother telling you guys that there's no factual basis for immigrants having cantaloupe calves? And that the only person who would make that up, remember the Dreamers were kids who were brought in by their parents. There's no evidence that any Dreamer was brought in by their parents dragging 75 pounds of marijuana in. He made that up, why? Because it's demagoguery. So you should hate the immigrants, even their little kids. You should hate them too because they have cantaloupe calves.
We're just getting
started. This is not
started.
subtle.
Yeah, we're just getting warmed up, as Cenk would say. So the next video is from 2016 during the elections, and here's what he has to say about whites versus everyone else.
I'd ask you to go back through history and figure out where are these contributions that have been made by these other categories of people that you're talking about. Where did any other subgroup of people contribute more to civilization?
Than white people?
Than Western civilization itself that's rooted in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States of America.
Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States of America, Western civilization. I mean, that's the thing that he does often. He will replace the word race with culture. So when he gets accused of racism, there will be, in his mind, plausible deniability.
Yeah, so let me just, because unfortunately there's a lot of young people on the internet who get influenced by this garbage, and some really juvenile thinkers that influence them in that direction, including Steve King. And they go, well, yeah, right, Western civilization. Now I made all of them Trump. Western civilization, it's great, right? And all the other civilizations suck. That's not remotely true. The Chinese civilization was amazing. So if you're talking about culture, there are, and I've said this 1,000 times, I'm not your everyday liberal. I believe that there are differences in culture, and I believe that a lot of the cultures have wonderful parts and not so great parts, and we should actually figure out what the good parts are and take that. But that doesn't mean, if you then say, well, Western civilization is all great and the rest of the cultures suck, you're an idiot, because that's not remotely true. It's not about being, oh, I need a safe space because you said the Chinese are bad. No, it's not about being politically correct. It's about being factually and historically correct. So for example, if you were to say, hey, Western civilization focuses on education. Well, there's a lot of that is correct. Public education started in Scotland, and it was a wonderful, basically not an invention, but a new way of doing things that greatly enhanced our society, culture, etc. That is why you had all those geniuses come out of Scotland, not because all of a sudden there were more smart people in Scotland like Adam Smith and Hume, etc., but because more people had opportunity because of public education. But you know who else emphasized education? And way long before Scotland did? China. Chinese culture is all built around education. And then you go to Egypt. In Egypt, like they conveniently forget every other civilization that has done miraculous things. Europe was a bunch of peasants groveling in mud at the time that Egypt had conquered the world. Now, does that make, if at that point you had a Steve King in Egypt, they'd be like, he's like, look, obviously these Western and Eastern Europeans are the worst of the worst. They've accomplished nothing. Egypt has built pyramids and the most amazing things that humanity has ever seen. And these white people are so stupid, they'll never amount to anything. And that would have been wrong, because different advancements in cultures are based on a lot of different things: politics, economics, geography, and the course of history. So at different times, Egypt, Rome, China, the Arabs, the Ottomans have all been, the Incas, the Mayas have all been dominant for different reasons. And they had great parts of their culture and they had terrible parts of their culture, all of them. But if you boil it down to race and me good Western civilization, all other ones bad, you're really incredibly unsophisticated. Plus, in the case of Steve King, racist, because he keeps saying, you see it in the clips, cantaloupe calves over here, white Western civilization, awesome.
One other thing that I wanted to quickly point out is that he is very supportive of the Confederate flag. In fact, he would display the Confederate flag in his office on his desk. He is a lawmaker from the state of Iowa. Okay, Iowa was part of the Union.
So it has nothing to do with the Civil War. So why is a guy from Iowa all of a sudden supporting the South in the Civil War? There's only one reason. Why? Because he thought, oh, the cotton gin. God, I love the culture in the South because the cotton gin was so efficient. No, when you hang a Confederate flag and you're not from the South, you are saying, I like racism. I like the treasonous guys in the South historically that betrayed the United States of America and murdered American soldiers at a greater rate than any other war that we have ever had, any other opponent or enemy we have ever had. Why? To protect slavery. That is a declaration of your racism. I mean, and if you didn't know all that history and you thought, hey man, I watched Dukes of Hazzard and I thought General Lee, the car looked cool and I like the Confederate flag, and I'm a regular dude, I'm an accountant and I just didn't know, okay, that's one thing. If you're a politician whose job is to know and you rub it in people's face and you have all these other videos out there, I mean, really, we're having this conversation about whether Steve King's racist?
We just gave you the tip of the iceberg when it comes to video evidence of his statements in regard to race and in regard to religion. So here is a video of Steve King. He was defending the use of the Confederate flag, and then he decided to defend the use of something else.
When I go to Germany and they've outlawed the swastika, I look at them and I think, we have a First Amendment. That can't happen here in the United States because we're open enough.
Wow. Okay, so look, guys, I believe in the First Amendment, and we defend it to the hilt in every case, including when the right wing say terrible things. So I believe it in principle, and so I would not ban the swastika here, okay? But it is one thing to say, even though the swastika is as abhorrent a flag as you could possibly find, we still should not ban it. It's another thing to say, as Steve King just said, as you saw, I mean, I go to Germany, I don't know why they got the swastika banned. I don't know, maybe, we don't have it banned here because we're open-minded. Wait, open-minded to what? Open-minded to what? Murder of 13 million people under that flag and under that banner? Look, it's one thing to say, I protect offensive speech. It's easy to protect non-offensive speech. Even those scumbag Nazis that killed all those people, I will defend their rights. It's another thing to say, hey, I'm open-minded, why don't we have swastikas here?
So he has this long record. I mean, we just gave you some of the examples. There's more out there, but if we were to do that, we would dedicate an entire show to it. So we're gonna move on to what the Republican said in regard to his New York Times interview. Now again, nothing else set Republicans off. They didn't speak out against Representative King. In fact, most Republicans would make excuses for him, defend him. And then now all of a sudden you have people like Mitt Romney, for instance, coming out aggressively against Representative King. Here's what he has to say.
I don't think there's a room for Steve King's comments in polite company or in the Republican Party or for that matter in Congress. I think he ought to step aside and I think Congress ought to make it very clear he has no place there.
So essentially calling him to step down as a representative.
So I'll say this, look, even though I think that the Republican Party has been doing this for decades, it's called the Southern strategy. It was meant to appeal to racists in the South and to get them to switch from the Democratic Party, which they used to support, to the Republican Party, and it was stunningly successful. They did switch over. That is why the Republicans now control all the red states in the South. And it was based, and by the way, to give credit to the RNC, two different heads of the RNC, Republican National Committee, have apologized for the Southern strategy because it was racist. And to this day, they still use code words, etc. The reason the Romneys and the Kings of the Romneys of the world get upset at Steve King and Donald Trump is they're like, you are revealing our ugly face. We are supposed to protect and hide that while we do the same exact things. Now, but to give them credit, it still matters to call out Steve King. It still matters to say, no, that's beyond the pale. Because that is also about our culture. You want to talk about real culture? Do we accept bald-faced racism, open racism, out of the closet racism, or don't we? So for Romney and Joni Ernst and so many others to come out and say, no, not acceptable, that's still a positive step.
Yeah, so Representative McCarthy and Representative Steve Stewart also came out against King, denounced his statements, called for him to step down in some cases. And so you're right, I'm glad that they're finally realizing what's going on. But on a recent episode of No Filter, one I had yesterday, for a very long time, people like Ben Shapiro, even after watching and responding directly to some of the videos that I showed you today, he would make excuses for King. I don't know what it is about this recent New York Times interview that changed their mind, but I guess all it took was this particular quote to make them realize, yeah, let's believe who Steve King is when he tells us who he is.
And the reason is because Ben Shapiro, Mitt Romney, etc., they don't mind the underlying racism, and bigotry. They don't mind it. They mind the fact that it was revealed. My God, Steve King, you're so unsophisticated, you're Trump level unsophisticated that you say, what's wrong with white supremacy? Well, then I gotta banish you, you idiot. Now, to give you, look, one last quote, because this is what Ben Shapiro, Mitt Romney, and all the rest thought was good enough. Steve King has said, we can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies. Now, if it isn't about race, what do you mean somebody else's babies? If it's about culture, why couldn't Latinos love Western civilization? My dad was born a Turkish Muslim in southeastern Turkey. He's atheist now, but he came in. He loves American culture, and that's part of why we moved here. Loves it, right? So, but what do you mean somebody else's babies? Well, I would be, I guess, somebody else's baby, right? And to Steve King, it doesn't matter how much I love American culture. It doesn't matter how much my dad believed in the American dream and moved his whole family here, because that's somebody else's babies. So obviously he's talking about race, but that line was not enough.
The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.